Today on August 8th, 1985, we're talking to William Warnes. All his friends and people who have known him for many, many years, of course, call him Bill, or Bill Warnes. Now we're going to let Bill talk to you about the early days in the area of Clark, which was formerly known as Amber, about 8 miles northwest of Withee. And Bill knows a great deal about the early days in Amber or Clark. Okay, Bill, let's hear something about your early history.
Thank you, Withee. I was born up at Clark, right next to the Black River, in a log house in 1906. See, that's what I'm talking about.
Your parents.
And my dad's name and dad and mother, Fred and Catherine Warnes. They were from Milwaukee. And they moved up there in the winter time when they came down on the river with a sled.
Were your parents born in Germany or in this country?
My parents both were born in Germany, and they didn't meet until they both worked at the same place at Milwaukee.
Okay, were you able to speak English from the time that you were a young boy?
I learned to speak English when I started school, because my dad he went to school a little bit to learn English, but my mother couldn't speak English. So I was German, is all I could understand. And when I started school at the age of 5, I walked 2 miles to a school. It was just a little shed. There were 5 students, my 2 sisters, myself, and Millard Searcy and Milford Wenzel.
Sounds like a family affair almost.
It's about what it was.
Was that called the Amber School or Clark School?
No, they had no name for it at that time. It was just a place to go to learn, for me to learn to speak English.
Now, you had said something about your older brothers didn't go to school there. Where did they have to go?
They went to school at Milwaukee.
Okay.
No, cut it off. They went and worked in the logging camps and in the lumbering mills is where they worked up in Maplehurst, 3 miles from where we lived. Mm-hmm. And they walked every morning and every night to their work. And then I remember them taking lanterns, coming home. It was dark when they'd come from work, and then they went to work because the wolves were so thick, and the wolves are afraid of a light. So they carried lanterns. And when we went to school, my 2 sisters and I, then we carried a lantern along because the teacher let us out a little earlier, but it's still going 2 miles through the woods. It was dangerous because the packs of wolves would be around us.
That's good.
And let's see, where was it?
About the teacher.
Now I'm going to tell you about my first teacher. My first teacher was Edna Searcy, and she was Millard's sister. She was an 8th grade teacher from the Maplehurst School.
8th grade graduate.
8th grade graduate was my teacher. And she would ask different questions, and when she'd ask me questions, I couldn't answer them. Then my dad said, if you can't answer them in English, then answer them in German. And she didn't like that, and then she'd slap me. So I got to the point where I wouldn't answer her at all. I'd just sit and look at her. And so then the girls, my sisters, would tell my dad that I didn't get far with the teacher. So he went to see the teacher, and the teacher said, Mr. Warnes, that's one way he will learn. And I think she was right. I'll tell you about my school days and about my teachers. After Mrs. Searcy, I had Mrs. Charrier, and, Miss Charrier, and then she married Minnis Munson. And from there on, it was Minnis Munson's wife, and I had her for 4 years. She tried to teach Millard, Searcy, and Milford Wenzel and myself some ninth grade. But that didn't last long because she couldn't take it. Because Clark, or Amber at the time, started growing. And they had a sawmill there. And one family after another started moving in, so they had to build a different school. So they built a school the same places where the old one was, only it was a bigger school, which was later called the Clark Community Hall, when it was moved down to Clark. And Clark at that time, within 2 years, grew to the point where there were 17 families living there, because they had a mill. Smith came in and put up a sawmill, and the farmers all hauled their logs and ties to the mill. And so the town grew very fast, in 2 or 3 years, and we had more students in school. So then, after Mrs. Monson at that time, she married Minnis Monson, was our teacher, then I graduated from the 8th grade from Mrs. Monson. And she only taught the high school, the 9th grade, for about 3 months. She couldn't handle it. There were too many students. Then they built a cheese factory at Clark. And from the Clark cheese factory, why, then it was from one to the other. The farmers started moving in. Different farmers came in. And they brought the milk to the cheese factory with horses. And with horses. Started going to high school at Withee for 3 months. But then it got to the point where the folks needed the horse to work in the woods. And I couldn't go to Withee because there was no place to stay. They didn't have no place for a boy to stay. Girls they would keep because they could do with dishes and things like that, but boys at that time didn't do that. So then I was sent out working in the woods. And I worked in the logging camps. And there were 42 men in that logging camp, and I was the only kid. And at that time, I was about, I would think, between 13 and 14 years old. And
Was this logging camp near Clark?
the logging camp was about 10 miles from Clark, northeast of Clark, up on the other side of Redville. And they had a cook by the name of Ole Peterson. And I used to go down and help him in the kitchen because the other men were all playing cards and they were drinking and swearing and what have you. And I just couldn't go along with it because I was just a kid. So I'm going to tell you about the man that I worked with out in the woods. His name was Henry Giroux, a very nice man. He was about, at that time I would say 30 years old. But he then got to be a minister and recently died in 1985 at the age of 98. He passed away. But he was a wonderful man. He would hold the saw, told me to hold the saw while he would notch my tree. The boss told us to cut 2 trees and then each one take an axe and cut the notch out. But Henry Giroux said, somebody has to hold the saw, so you hold the saw and I'll notch your tree for you. And I, excuse me, I knew why he was doing it, but I didn't, it didn't seem to make any difference because he was feeling sorry for me because I was a kid. And the poor soul, he finally passed away. Before the sawmill came to Clark, in the summer months, my dad and I would haul, and my younger brother, we would skid those logs that the river had floated up into the woods and up in the brush, and we would drag them up along the river, and in the fall of the year, then they would notify us to roll them into the water, and we would roll them into the Black River, and they would float down to Black River Falls. And they had men that would ride those logs. A man by the name of Ed Poppy showed us kids how to ride logs, but of course we never could do it. But he was just an expert on it. He could ride them. It doesn't make a difference how fast they rolled or anything, but he could ride them logs. But then from there on, they come with the mill at Clark. And from the Clark, then I worked in the mill, and there they sawed ties and lumber. And they would get as high as 500,000 feet of logs hauled in the wintertime, and we would haul them on sleds with 4 horses. And we had ice tracks. We had sleighs that were 8 feet wide, and they had tracks with runners. They made the runners and they'd ice them. They'd fill up the tanks from the river, in the Black River, and they would ice them tracks, and them sleighs would run in that track, and they had 4 horses pulling them sleighs. And when they went up the hill, they had, wherever there was hill, there was what they call a tow team. And they would take that tow team and help them up the hill, and then from there on the 4 horses would take them. And they hauled as high as 2,000 feet of logs on one sled. The sleighs, the runners were 12 feet apart. And that was all iced runners, tracks. And the sled would get into that track and it wouldn't get out. It'd stay there. And how many times we were down by the Black River and we helped them put that water in that tank when they iced those tracks. And to us kids, it was fun at that time.
And the railroad had already come through at Clark, and I understand that they built a little spur or a little side track. Is that right, Bill?
That's right. And my dad was behind that. He got to be a town chairman of Taylor in Maplehurst, and he pushed for a side track so they could haul their logs and their lumber and ship the lumber out so they didn't have to haul it to Owen. So they did. The railroad company put a sidetrack into what they called Amber, or Clark now, and they put a sidetrack in there, and it would hold as high as 15 and 20 cars. And then we would load the logs and the lumber on them cars and ship it out. And every so often the train would switch and take them cars out and put new cars back in again to get rid of the material that they had sawed when the mill was up there. And of course I worked in the mill in the summer months, and in the winter months it was out in the woods.
Yes.
But in the summer months it was the mill.
And I remember, Bill, that my dad, who was a blacksmith, he worked winters up at Clark in the blacksmith shop to shoe those horses and fix the sleighs and the chains. And my first ride on the train was, which was called the Scoot. We rode in this little red caboose to Owen and
right.
saw the very first movie that I had ever seen. We had friends in Owen, and they took us to the movie. And it was when knighthood was in flower with, I don't remember her name, her last name was Davies or Davis, but that Scoot would whistle at a certain time. I think it was 10:45, and if we were anywhere away from home and we heard the Scoot blowing its whistle, that meant we had better get home or Dad would be awfully cross.
I remember that when that Scoot went through, and I remember that so well because that's the only way we had to get to Owen. And we would ride to Owen, and they would charge us 25 cents, which was like $2.50 now. But we rode to Owen, and then we'd take the next train and ride back. And if there was no train, we walked back home. So, I'll tell you something about how fast Clark grew. It was a small town, and it had 17 buildings in it. And they had a cook shack. They had a boarding house. They had a store. They had a depot. Then they finally decided to build a school. And they built a 2-room school, a brick school up at Clark. And that all within a period of, I would say, 15 years.
And what year was it that they built the new school?
1919.
And what did they do with that old one?
And the old one was moved down to Clark, and they made a community hall out of it. And that is where the Neiman girls and the Warrens boys entertained an awful lot for the different people that had parties and dances. And everybody got together. It was just one community where everybody helped each other, liked each other, and lived together. It was just a happy thing. And that was in 1919 and 1920.
The cheese factory came to Clark about that time, too. Could you tell us something about the early days of the cheese making?
Yes, Vee, I can. There was a fellow by the name of Otto Brown, built a cheese factory. And he went around the farmers and told them that he would make their cheese for them and they should bring the milk down, which they did. And the farmers would then get together and maybe one farmer would haul 1 week, haul 4 or 5 farmers' milk, and then the next farmer would haul, and they changed off bringing the milk to the cheese factory. Then, as the cheese factory, after he had that, and it progressed, and the farming got better all the way through. There were more farmers came in. As the timber was cut and the land was cleared, more farmers came, and they would then bring the milk to the factory, and it finally got to the point where the Otto Brown sold out to Art Racler. And Art Racler and his wife were the ones that made the cheese. So then, in the meantime, in the summertime, I would go up and help them make cheese because they got so much milk, they couldn't handle it between him and his wife. So they asked me if I would come and help them, besides doing some farm work at home with my folks, come and help them make cheese. So I learned how to make cheese. Steve Chesnick and myself made cheese for 2 weeks at a time up at the Art Racler's factory. And that was at the time when that tornado went through in 1924. September 22nd in 1924.
21st.
21st. And so anyway, that was terrible. We were at Clark then had a little restaurant too, and we were at the restaurant when that tornado came.
That was a Sunday afternoon.
That was on a Sunday afternoon, and we all went into the store basement, the people that were up at Clark. I remember running up the road and running up towards the buildings and hollering, "Tornado, tornado," whether they knew what I meant, I don't know, but I done the hollering, and come to the store basement. And from the store basement, we went up into the window, went upstairs and took a look, and I see it going across the road up there by, at that time, it was up where Arntz lived. And I could see trees and buildings and whatnot coming out of that cloud and going back in again. It would draw it right back in. And the bottom of a tornado is like the size of a milk can, and it's white, just pure white. And it just draws everything where it points, it draws it to it. Within hundreds of feet, it goes right into that whirling wind.
I remember that it took that bridge too, didn't it?
It took the railroad bridge, and I can tell you something about that. There was Bill Colester come running up the railroad track, and he had pants on, no shirt, and he had stones, little stones in his face. He was fishing when the bridge went off, and he come running and said the storm took the bridge out. The storm took the bridge out. There was a train was due about that time, and there was a fellow by the name of Domaine Kennedy took some lantern and tied some red handkerchief out, a kerosene lantern, and run up the railroad track to stop the train. And the train kept blowing his whistle, and he stayed right in the track and kept flagging that train. And finally they stopped, and the train stopped, and he ran up to the conductor and told him the tornado went through and took the bridge out. And they couldn't believe it. So they went onto the side track of Clark. It was open, so they could go onto the side track with the train. Then my brother and I, we took the car and we went around. We couldn't use no telephone, and we went around over to Redville where we could get to a telephone, and called Owen and told him that the bridge was gone. They should stop all the railroad, all the trains. And they said they didn't believe it because their section crew had been out there not over 2 hours. And I said, believe it, because the bridge is gone. This tornado took the railroad bridge out. It stretched the ties and the rails for about a half a mile each direction. It pulled them endways. When that bridge went, that was a 125-ton bridge, and the water hitting that bridge took the bridge right out, and it stretched the rails endways, pulled them endways. So we went back again, my brother and I, and we went and got our guns, because wherever that tornado went through, there were cows laying in the pastures that had their insides busted out, and their broken legs, and they bellowing, and so we'd run from place to place and shot the cows to get them out of misery. Then we got up to where they called Harry Norris, where it had crossed, and it took that family was in the house, and we found Mr. Norris on alongside of a woven wire fence in a straw, and we packed him into a grain sack. He was a man that weighed 170 pounds, but we got him into a grain sack. He was just mangled, just smashed. And his wife was killed, and one of the girls. The other girl, my brother took in the car and took her down to Owen, and I stayed there and helped clean up some of the things till my brother come back and picked me up, and we went back home.
Mm-hmm. And south of Clark, on the Kangas farm, they were having a Finnish Sunday school.
That's right.
And Mr. Hill, Walter Hill, was killed there, as was Mrs. Donovan. Mrs. Donovan was a daughter of the Vennets, and her three little preschool girls were also killed.
All killed.
And Ben Hill lost a leg, but it hasn't kept him from doing his work. He's been a mechanic and a fixer of tractors and cars
and a
all
wonderful
his
man
life.
for that purpose.
Yes.
And he's very good. And so I could go on for hours if I tell about.
Tell us a little bit about what was done with the leftover after the cheese was made. What was done with the whey?
The whey was hauled back home, and they raised the pigs on that. I remember of hauling 3-4 cans a day down to our place that we raised pigs, and many of the farmers would take the whey and for the pigs, purpose of raising pigs. That was very good for them. And then, of course, the big trouble comes to cleaning the cans for the next morning, for that evening for the milk, and it was hard to get that out. But they seemed to get it done, and that's what happened with the whey that they got from the cheese factory.
What about that leftover smell that we always smelled in the ditches?
Well, at that time they didn't have no DNR, and they didn't seem to mind too much about it, because it was just one of those things that you had to live with. Because what were you going to do with it? Right next to the cheese factory there was a creek that went down towards the river, but by the time it got down to the river, it had cleared itself over, running over the rocks and the gravel, and because that's all gravel and sand down in there. And it ran over that, so when it got to the river, it didn't harm the water any, didn't hurt the water any.
Can you tell me about what was done with the whey here in Owen in later years?
In later years, there's a factory came in here, what they call the whey factory. And now, talking about the condensery, that's what they call the foremost. They took the whey in from the farmers, they hauled it in big trucks, and then they made powdered milk out of it, or powdered whey. And they used that for human consumption. And that was the foremost down here now at Owen, where now they are still operating, but under a different name. It used to be the Western Condensery, now it's the foremost. And we, before this came in, we had what they called a carnation milk plant. And in the later years, from when I worked in the woods, I started hauling milk. And I hauled Vienna's folks' milk. And I hauled, but I didn't want to touch any milk within 2 miles of the cheese factory. But somehow or other, it seemed like the condensery paid so much more, the farmers wanted to go to the condensery, so then Milford Wenzel started a route. And he took the close farmers to the factory and hauled them to Abbotsford to the condensery. So when he done that, then the farmers closer to the cheese factory asked me why I couldn't take them. And I said, I will take you. As long as there's a truck in here doing it anyway, I might as well take you. And so then I took him and hauled him to the condensery. And I hauled milk for 18 and a half years to the condensery.
Was that with a truck, Bill, or in the winter time was it horse and
It
sleigh?
was horses in the winter time, and I had a little cab on my sleigh, and I used to have a little stove in there, a 5-gallon gas can. I made a stove out of it and burned little pieces of coal and little chunks of wood 4 inches long, just little blocks of wood, and that's what I rode in. And I used to have 4 horses on my sleigh, and I'd go around and pick up the milk and take it to the condensery, and sometimes I was 9:30, 10 o'clock at night when I got home, but the next day, why, it was the same thing over again. But I had horses enough that I could go on and take a different team and go around.
And I understand that you brought some things home for the farmers from town, too.
Many times I brought feed and groceries and baked goods. I hauled the bakes for the Clark store. I hauled the bread and buns and all of that. I would get it from the own bakery and take it out to the Clark store and haul it for them and deliver it that day when I'd get back. It might have been late, but they got it anyway.
Yeah, who were some of the guys who owned the Clark store? We talked about the store at Clark, and there were several different owners. Who were those?
The Clark store was first owned by James Sheen. And then the next one came was, see if I can think of his name here, Charlie Very. And then came Ole Peterson, and then Al Zenzel, and then Orville Thorson, and then Frank Vanderwiggen. And then Joe Warnes was the last one to have the store, and then now it belongs to Frank Bartasevich, but he does not have groceries there anymore.
Oh, he
I
doesn't.
talked to him, and he does not have the store. He's just living there.
I see.
So the store is not in existence, but he and his mother lived there for quite a few years, but his mother passed away about 3 years ago.
What?
And he still lives there.
There was a Finnish man, too. Who was that Finnish man that owned that? Was it-
Raponen.
I see.
That was Raponen. Matt Raponen. And I can remember when Matt Raponen going to the head of the stairs when the folks were upstairs, and he would say, Mate, Matt was the store owner, and he'd say, Mate customary. That would mean, Matt, you've got a customer.
Very good.
But things have changed so terrific and so terrible the last 40 years, you just can't imagine. It's beyond imagination.
Clark is another ghost town, as are so
No,
many others around
That's right.
here.
They at one time had 17 and 18 families living there. They had a big 2-room school. They had the community hall. They had, well, I don't know how, there were so many things that were going on at Clark, and now it's a ghost town. There's nothing left. Smiths and them days were the busiest guys around the country because everybody would bring their horses there to get shod. And not only horses, wagon wheels, and Lord knows what not, everything to be fixed. And the blacksmith who had to do it. And John Niemanen was our blacksmith, and he was a wonderful blacksmith. I can remember the things that he made for us, and he hammered out scythes. And I still have one of those scythes that you cut grass with. And it's just, well, I can't explain it to you. You'd almost have to see it. But it's a handmade scythe, and it's a wonderful thing. And so, in 1945, after John Niemanen retired, there was a man by the name of Alvin Pribenow moved into Clark. And he done the blacksmith work down there. And, of course, the blacksmith work at that time then wasn't near what it was before, because it was the trucks that came in. And I started trucking milk when it used to be with horses, and then it got to the trucks. And so the blacksmith work kind of played out, except for fixing, and then they got rubber-tired wagons, and so there was no more blacksmith work to that. So Pribenow then died at a young age, but his children, they're still living around here, some of the children, and they're scattered all over, just like the majority of families are.
And
Now I'm going to tell you how I met my wife. I met her up at Clark, and we went together about 3 years. And after then we decided we'd better get married, so we got married. She taught up there at Clark, and I hauled milk. And I was a milk hauler for 18 years. And from milk hauling, we finally sold our farm up at Clark to Frank Vitek. And then I bought a place over here on 29, the old Menges farm. So the wife and I both got down and hustled and started working, and we fixed up that place, built new barns, and fixed the house all up and got that all fixed up. And then the guys from Thorpe were after me to haul gas, and they sat in the yard most of the time until I decided I'd haul gas for them, and I quit. I sold my milk route to Peterson and Jim Peterson. And then from there on, I started hauling gas for the Thorpe Co-op, and I hauled for them for just about 10 years. And I met an awful lot of people hauling gas. So I started with 58 customers, and I wound up with 550. So I was plenty busy in my days, and besides, I was trying to farm. But there was a family that Evie had in school. She taught at the Moody School then, while she was down here. And she taught at the Moody School, and she had a family that had some young fellas down there by the name of Mitchells. And these boys asked if they could stay at our place and help with the chores, if they could stay at our place and go to high school. And so I gave them a small wage, and they stayed at our place, and one boy after the other would stay at our place and help with the chores. So I wasn't crowded too bad with the farm work, because these boys stayed summer and winter. And I paid them a little wage, not much, but they seemed to be satisfied, and they're very good friends of us to this day. So I think everything turned out pretty good, and my wife and I are still living together. We just had our 50th wedding anniversary, and she seems to be satisfied. I don't know how she can stand it, but she does.
Now, you have left out an important job that you carried on, something about hauling school children. Tell us about that.
Oh, yes.
Anna Lehman and Keskanecki, who interviewed Bill and Evie Warnes. Bill finished the tape by telling us that he had hauled school children to the Withee and Owen High School for 20 years, beginning in 1945, until he had to retire. And I want to thank Bill and Evie for the interesting bits of history that they have recorded for the Withee Public Library.